You know the problem with drama?
I hate drama, but go on. What's the main problem?
It's junk food. People scarf it up. It attracts attention, and people don't listen to anything but that buzzing, that smell of it, rather than the substance, because there's no more substance there. It's like it covers over and occludes and even devolves the substance of a discourse. It's like drama.
Everyone has to have a side, and their side has to win. So you just talk past each other. I think that's what happens.
Yeah. So do you have drama in your life?
Not really. I feel like, should we address like the elephant drama in the room? What I don't want to do is, so I don't want to cause drama, and I don't want to be involved in anyone's drama. I think that's important to say.
Yeah.
But I think there are things that have been said in the midst of drama that maybe need addressing, and I can help to clear up some things for some people.
Okay.
Might be a good start.
Okay. So there is, and we could do this very tactfully and not participate in drama, but actually get to the substance of the matter. First and foremost, my whole thing about drama is that there's these human beings that are important, and we should try to figure out how to treat people humanely. And, you know, I don't do that myself. I fail at that, but that's what I'm striving toward, even though I fail constantly. But there's human beings. There's also this thing called science, truth, reality, and that stuff, and human beings are enmeshed in that just as much as we're enmeshed in drama. So maybe you could help us navigate towards the reality in a humane way about the human beings, specifically human beings who, and I don't know the words for this, would suffer a disorder of sexual development or I don't know the correct activist language.
There is no correct language, really, because people with differences of sex development themselves like different language. So kind of walking around on eggshells becomes a bit of a pointless endeavor. So I would say DSDs because I have a DSD, and that's what I call it. Okay. So there's the current debate. It has been about how people with DSD should be classified, I think would be the best way to describe it. So whether people with DSDs are rightly classified as male or female. So we're talking about sex.
And not just classified, but treated.
Treated, yes. So it's not just... and I think that's a really good clarification, because I think one of the problems with the discussion is that we can become very focused on one scientific measure and forget that we're talking about bodies. So while we might say biologists would look at, obviously when they're describing sex, they're talking about reproduction, so they're talking about gametes with humans. That's fine theoretically when we're talking about sex, but when we're talking about bodies, it's going to be more complicated, and that's where society comes in as well.
Okay, that is really interesting. This is the first time that I've had a good faith discussion with an interlocutor using the word bodies. That's a kind of a trigger word for me. So what do you mean by bodies? It sounds kind of dehumanizing, or it has been used in dehumanizing ways. So what do you mean by bodies?
Well, because when we're talking about sex and how we classify people, we're talking about their bodies. We're talking about what we observe of their bodies when they're born, usually. Yeah. So I'm not meaning to take the person out of it. I'm kind of trying not to be personal with it either by explaining that's what it is. We're just looking at bodies. We're looking at how we're going to classify the bodies. And for 99.9+% of us, that's really straightforward. They look at our genitals, we'll have a penis, or we'll have a vulva. You know, people say vagina, but nobody's looking for the vagina. That's internal, it's the vulva. And then we'll be classified accordingly. Penis male, vagina female. And even for most DSDs, that's how it goes. We're born with a phenotype, that's what we call it in this, the phenotypic sex that fits into male or female. So when you look at our bodies, it's instantly recognizable as male or female.
And the phenotype is the expression of the genome.
Yes.
It's the expression. It's how the body is built according to the instructions.
Yes.
and its reading of the instructions.
Yeah. And what we're told is that there is, I use the phrase, I think, in your comments, platonic ideal. And this actually comes from trans activists who sort of use this as well, and Fausto Sterling relies heavily on this. So the platonic ideal is when we have a female phenotype, there are certain things we would expect to find. And if we went looking further, we'd expect to find certain internal organs like a uterus, cervix, fallopian tubes. We'd expect to find ovaries, and we'd expect to find an XX karyotype. That's typically what we'd expect to find. A DSD is where something in those things doesn't quite line up. So we're not talking about platonic ideals anymore. If someone had a male phenotype, so a penis, we would expect to find testes, and we would expect to find no internal organs like the uterus or the cervix or the fallopian tube. And we would expect to find an XY karyotype. Again, there's going to be differences within that. So some people have a different karyotype, or you do get men who will have uteruses and cervixes. They can't, they're not functional. What that means is there's a hormone that they don't have or they don't respond to that didn't break those structures down.
Oh, okay.
So a better way to look at it, I think we kind of look at it backwards. A better way, I think, to look at it so I work for a DSD charity these days, and we explain this to people all the time. And we don't work backwards, we work forwards. So you start off with the chromosomes, which will be X and Ys. A Y chromosome is typically going to mean male, and a lack of Y chromosome is typically going to mean female. On the Y chromosome, there's a gene called the SRY gene. And the SRY gene is actually what causes male development. So some people with XY chromosomes, they don't have the SRY gene, so they will then follow a female developmental pathway. If they have the SRY gene, then testes will form, and then the testes will produce two hormones. One is AMH, that's what prevents or breaks down the Müllerian structure, so the uterus, the cervix, the fallopian tubes, that prevents them from growing in a male.
Well, you said that they're broken down, so the baby's already assembling that before it decides
everyone's born with the potential. There's two kits, and everyone's born with both kits on board, if you like, is the best way to describe it.
So females actually have proto or pre the structures to build the male reproductive system, or kind of already in place?
The genitals grow from the same place. So out of there's a bud, and out of that will either become female genitals or male genitals. Okay. But the Müllerian structures, which are the female internal structures, everyone has the potential for that to grow, and it's a hormone in males called AMH, which prevents that from growing. Breaks it down, prevents it from growing. Oh, okay. In some men, that won't work, so they will grow those structures. Then the second hormone is testosterone, particularly dihydrotestosterone. If the testicles are able to produce enough of that, and if there are androgen receptors that can respond to that, then a penis will grow. If either enough testosterone isn't produced or the androgen receptors aren't working, then the body will follow the female pathway instead, and it will develop female genitals. So that's how it works in a nutshell. There are 40 different DSDs. They're all very rare. I can't explain every single one, but that's the most common pathways with it.
And with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, which I've spoken about at least once, but I got some details wrong previously. What I heard was that puberty happens and something doesn't happen with the male who has complete insensitivity to the androgen, develops as a female, and then somebody realizes something at some point.
In the case of complete androgen insensitivity, it's the receptors to the testosterone that don't work. In that case, what the body does, it will convert the testosterone into estrogen and will develop as female. So the baby is born with a female phenotype with female genitals. At puberty, what will happen, if the testes are left internally, that didn't always happen in the past. If CAIS was discovered earlier, they would remove the testes. But if they're left in place, they will produce testosterone during puberty, but that will be converted to estrogen. So the body will continue to follow a female developmental pathway. The hips will widen, the breasts will get bigger and things like that. the thing that will usually alert someone to not having CAIS is that their period won't start because they don't have the internal structures for a period.
Okay. But they have all the external structures for
a female.
For a female.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets dicey or interesting, because the people who have that, which are very rare, it's 1 out of 100,000 or something like that.
Something I can't remember.
Really,
Very rare.
When we begin to speak about them in terms of politics or activism, people have different sides, and the human being's lost in that, because this human being, one comment on the drama video that I made was that it just asked a moral question. If this, let's just say this girl at 14 is discovered, or 13 or 14 is discovered to be a male, should she be forced to now be a boy, act like a boy, go to the men's restrooms, participate in men's sports? Should she be treated as a male now, societally, if everything that plugs her into society is female, except for the very, the code and the internal structures, or that's the question, and I don't know how to navigate that question. So speaking to you as somebody who advocates for this, how would this group prefer, how should we even enter into this conversation, and what's the proper way to speak about this?
Well, CAIS women understand themselves to be women. They understand themselves to be female. Not all CAIS women have a good understanding of their condition, which isn't their fault, because often they haven't had it explained well, and there used to be a history of leaving information out. So sometimes they would remove the testes in the past, but they would tell the girls that they'd removed ovaries. So the girls just believed they'd had cancerous ovaries removed, things like that. But they're seen as, I think, other than by niche people in a debate that isn't really about these women, they're seen as female. They're understood, like their medical marker is female. There's no debate about whether that's correct or not for them. You wouldn't know someone with complete androgen sensitivity. If you met them, they wouldn't look different to only in as much as all women look different to each other, but they don't look any different to other women. I'm not sure, it's on a practical level, I don't know why that's worth arguing. I don't know how that would work, how we would police. And this is why I think trans activists often will laugh at gender critical people, the idea of policing gonads or policing chromosomes. But that is kind of what's been suggested here, that somehow we would have a chromosome detector or something to know who should be where, or police those spaces.
Well, I mean, to try to enter into the gender critical argument to what extent they want to argue this, I could see that they are trying to police women's spaces to keep women safe and to give them privacy and, to make things with regards to sports fair. But because the CAIS, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome people, it's such a small population, we couldn't actually measure the criminality. Is the psychology typical female? Is everything typical female? The behavior?
I once read, but I don't know, and I tried to track down the research behind this. I once read that actually CAIS women have very low levels of criminality, which is interesting. Like I say, I never managed to follow that up and find out. You froze them, by the way. I
have. You might just have to deal with me being stuttery to your eyes.
That's fine.
Not as buttery as you prefer.
That's great. So yeah, I don't, and I think it's quite cruel to suggest that what you would do is the day that a young girl, because that's what a girl with CAIS is, unless we're saying that no one's a girl until we know for sure what gonads they have. to then say on the day that she finds out she will never have children, well, now you're a boy and you will go in with the boys to the boys' changing room, you'll be in the boys' PE lessons, you will be not allowed to be with your friends in certain spaces. I think that's very cruel. I know, again, there's people in the gender critical camp who are they're fed up of being asked to be kind. But I think you can push back on that kind of being asked to be kind where you don't have to, while also thinking sensibly about the people that we're talking about. And like I say, that unless we're going to say we can't know if someone's female until we've done a gonadal biopsy, they're girls and then women.
In the gender critical side of this debate, DSDs are used for certain outcomes, and then the TRAs are using DSDs to make certain outcomes. And we've spoken about how DSDs shouldn't be used by the trans rights activists. But maybe you could explain how they're used and in what way you see intersex being used to advance the gender ideology.
So trans activists use DSDs to deconstruct the idea that sex is a thing. So if we have these edge cases, then we can't say what sex is for sure, and therefore sex doesn't exist.
So they want like this gray zone, this flux to be able to express these different things that they call gender. Yeah.
And then also there are some trans activists who use DSDs as a opt-in. Kind of they'll say that being trans is somehow like having a DSD, or it's like a mental form of intersex, and therefore that they think that will give them some legitimacy or will elicit more sympathy from people, maybe. So that's how they use it. And then they will use it as well so they will claim things like that there are women with DSDs who have penises, therefore women can have penises. There are men with DSDs who have vaginas, therefore men can have vaginas. This isn't, well, I've spent a long time with other gender critical people arguing this isn't accurate. There are no intersex women with penises, and there are no intersex, to use the trans terminology, men with vaginas. What's happening with some gender critical people now is they are agreeing with the Platonic idea, and they are now saying as well that there are men with vaginas in the case of CAIS women, who they are saying is men, and there are women with penises in the case of XX men, XX males who have penises.
Could you briefly explain the XX male, how that is built?
An XX male is sometimes the SRY gene can translocate onto an X chromosome, or it's another gene, SOX9, I think. Someone will no doubt correct me if I'm wrong on that. And what that means then is that an XX individual will follow a male developmental pathway. Okay.
With pretty much everything included in that.
They would be they would look like a typical man, a typical boy when they're born. Okay. So it's sort of used that way to argue that you can have women with penises and men with vaginas. Like I say, that seems to be what some gender criticals are now arguing as well. I don't understand, to be honest, how that helps gender critical people in their arguments. I can't tell you why they're arguing that. Again, it's not how society or medicine or anything would view bodies. Even allowing for the trans thing, again, I said in the comments to your video, that trans people aren't arguing that trans women are the same sex as women. When they use the word female, they don't mean female the sex, they mean female the gender identity. Yeah. They know that we're different sexes, hence you have the cis trans binary that tells us that people are different sexes. They even have their own sayings, AFAB and AMAB, to describe the sex on our birth certificates. What they're arguing is that gender identity is more important than sex. And really that's what I would say gender criticals would be, that's the argument they need to deconstruct. They don't really need to use DSDs to also deconstruct sex. Okay.
So you've been involved in this conversation for a while, so I'm sure that your ideology has kind of changed, and then also how you express it too. Like the the genome of your ideology, and then the phenotype, how you actually express your ideology. So where are you now? Have you gone through certain changes, like you were more gender critical, less gender critical? Is there like a way for you that you've been able to describe like your thinking on this sex, gender?
I think I'm just less involved in the gender side of the debate. It doesn't...
Did you get tired of that? Did you see that it was not leading anywhere?
And I think a lot of people are doing work with that now that I don't really see that I have much to add to the conversation particularly. Mm-hmm. Because I work with a DSD charity now, and that's like most of what I do, I find that's just more useful. And there's times when that touches on the gender debate, like we're looking at education resources at the moment, and of course there's a lot of things in schools that are very influenced by LGBTI groups, so I'm touching on it that way, but I just don't want to be part of the gender wars. And I find that there's no point. There's no, like, arguing with trans activists on Twitter that sex isn't a spectrum, or arguing with gender critical people. And again, not all gender critical people, I realise this is like, it's a niche sort of corner of gender critical. Arguing with them that men don't have vaginas. What's the point? Like, no, they're not going to win with that kind of argument anyway, because that's not how anything works.
Practically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And DSDs, they're not a new subject. Just because you heard of it 5 minutes ago from a trans activist doesn't mean that there isn't a whole wealth of information and knowledge behind the sex that people are raised as if they have a DSD and things like that. I feel like this is such a serious subject.
I know. I wanted to get into something fun.
I know. It's not very like fun conversational. I need to work on my like intersex banter. But it's difficult because like I could joke about my own condition, but I like joking about someone else's always feels.
Are you creating memoir? So when you're dead, you're gonna say, "Okay, here it is. Here's my story, guys." Hopefully, somebody wants
to be like private or secret about it. There's not much more to say because I don't know much more like for myself. No, my mum is desperate for me to write a memoir of me having a DSD and how that looked from like my point of view. Mm-hmm. She's really keen for me to, and I've had other people say it, but I don't.
Do you not like the process of writing, or it's specifically the memoir?
I think it's specifically the memoir. I don't know that I don't know that it's that interesting to people. I found out I couldn't have children. I didn't have children. I went and did some other things.
Well, what do you, beyond then this, what do you find most interesting now in 2020, 21, 22? What's obsessing you? Or?
Well, I mean, the latest drama has sort of taken a bit of my time, just trying to understand how that happened, because the last time I really looked at the gender debate, gender criticals were arguing something very different. So I've just been very interested in that. And then the rest of it is just, like I say, it's really just advocating for people with DSDs, actually for with our schools resources. One of the things we've been really keen to get across we met with the Department for Education in the UK, and we've met with other people. And one of the things we've been really keen to get across is that you've got these people using DSDs as ideological tools, while forgetting there are children with DSDs sitting in those classrooms having these things said to them. And I suppose it takes us back to the beginning. It's bringing the people back into this. We're talking about people, not abstract medical conditions, not a pick and mix of body parts. There's real people living their lives out there, and some of them are living quite tough lives with this and have other needs. We lose sight of, lots of people with DSDs have related disabilities or quite serious health conditions, and we forget all of that. In this debate around how much they prove or disprove the identities of trans people, ultimately, or
the necessity for a very absolutist, non-gender, purely scientific classification of male and female, so that we can completely control this and.
The problem problem with this is that there is no, again, I said this in the comments to your video, there is no one single factor, and people try to chase the single factor, they're going to be perpetually disappointed by that. I know the current thing is gonads, but we have testes, we have ovaries. There are also ovotestes, which is a mixture of both. There are people who have streak gonads, which is neither. Where do we put those if we're being so binary with this? Mm-hmm. We've still got, the edge cases will still exist. Whichever you choose, there will be people who don't fit that perfectly.
And what is the guiding principle then for the edge cases? How do we respect that and deal with it ideologically? Because it upsets our ideology.
Well, I think the first thing to accept, and people won't like this, but it's just how it is that CAIS is not an edge case. First of all, complete androgen sensitivity syndrome isn't an edge case in that they're born with a female phenotype that looks exactly like a female phenotype. There's no ambiguity with CAIS. So if we're talking about ambiguous cases, so ones where the genitals look different, and it might not be clear at first if it's the penis that we're looking at or a clitoris. What they do then it becomes important to look at the gonads and the chromosomes and the hormones, because then we need to understand, well, what are we looking at? What genitals does this person have? And by understanding the development pathway they followed, we can work that out. So we will go and look, well, they've got a Y chromosome or a lack of Y chromosome, they've got testes or they've got ovaries, and that would help us to understand.
Well, and getting to that information would help the parents and the child to psychologically understand it, but also the medical profession itself to understand any sorts of diseases or problems that would happen later on down the road. To what extent is that society's job? Is that something
I don't think society needs. It's so rare and it's so complicated. Like if you asked a doctor who determines the sex of these babies, who works out if these babies are male or female, they're not going to give you like a one answer, because they're rare and they're complex. Like development's very complex, because they're going to be looking into the future for the child. So trying to predict, well, what will puberty do? What development pathway will they follow there? That's how they would work it out, and you're just not going to get an answer. And it has to, I think that's one of the things where you can just say, well, we leave it to the experts, because that's what they do and they know what they're doing. And I think that's fine sometimes. And
that has very little bearing, or it might have some bearing on what kind of person that person turns out to be. But, just because you have a girl baby doesn't mean that you know what kind of woman she's going to be, or a boy, a man, or a child, an adult. So the bearing that this condition has on the human experience is not. You can't just predict. Yeah, and there are, I know. People will then say how sometimes doctors might get it wrong. This is rare, and it's often relying on cases in the past where maybe we didn't have as good understanding as we have now, or doctors weren't quite honest with their patients and did surgeries and hid information. People worry about where the cases where it's wrong, where doctors might get it wrong. That's very rare, and it's historical. If that was to happen now, it would be a baby. So it might be that like in some places you have to register the birth in a certain amount of time, and it might be that the doctors haven't quite got all the tests back yet, but they need to make a determination, and they'll say male or female. That'll be put down, and then another couple of times, more tests, a couple of weeks, more tests are done, new information, and then the birth certificate will be changed. So again, this is not about identity. It's not about the baby saying I feel a certain way. This is just new information. And we have in the UK, and I would assume in America, although I know it will vary state to state, we have different processes for gender recognition, which is a trans person declaring an identity and a mistake made by doctors. And they're completely separate. The law recognizes these things as completely separate. So it should be, I think, again, like that should make it easier for people to separate it as well. Yeah. So why is it fascinating to you, this recent drama?
Yeah. So I was really fascinated into how gender critical people, some gender critical people, had arrived where they were saying some men have vaginas, some women have penises, and I just saw quite serious misinformation spreading through. For all I'm not on social media taking part in the gender wars. I am in some Discord groups and things like that. And I could see this misinformation coming back. And there were some things that were just lies.
About CAIS or about DSDs?
Yeah, about CAIS. And I don't know, it's one of these things, I'm really reluctant. All the time that we're talking about this, I'm aware of the fact that any day a girl with CAIS could come across any video where I'm talking, and I don't want, and I'm really conscious of protecting girls with CAIS. But I saw, for example, one claim was that girls with CAIS would, if they were placed in a women's prison, that they would grow penises and rape women. Now that's...
Wait, what?
That's, yeah. That's not true. Yeah.
Somebody actually seriously wrote that somewhere?
Yeah.
Or said that? What kind of fantasy world? That's a weird, strange...
Well, that was the person who was making the videos said it in the comments to the videos. That was the point. I'd seen it happening and people kept sending me things, and I was kind of at first just oh, hopefully that will just die down because enough people understand this better. And that was the point actually where I stepped in to argue with the person, because I felt that because it was just such an obvious lie. And like I say, I just thinking of a young girl coming across that unchallenged, it's quite horrific, really.
What do you think they want then, in arguing about intersex and DSCs?
I don't know. The two people who seem to be mainly pushing this, again, feel free to but are two people who are detransitioned and who fully bought into this, the opposite side. And I think they've brought with them the intersex stuff. So they might have dropped the gender identity, but they still believe the intersex stuff, and that's what they're using. And I think it's a lot of confusion on their part and a lot of overconfidence in what they think they know because they can Google science papers.
Mm-hmm. And the science is so complex, just like the COVID science. You could pick 20 papers to either build up your case or break it down because it's just so complex.
Yeah. But in the end, the world works a certain way, and really what I want to explain is how it works. So you can tell me you think it should work a different way, whatever. This is still how it works at the moment, and there's no discussion about that changing, other than people who have very extreme ideas about gender, because this isn't what the debate is about. There's no government talking about how we're going to classify people with DSDs. No doctors are. That's not happening.
You mean socially?
Yeah,
the M or the F on the birth certificate, or the bathroom door or something like that.
Yeah. No one's, and that's, like I say, that's not what the debate is about. It's not even what trans activists are asking for. So we should.
So what is the debate about? And then we can just let it go. Just say this is what the point is.
The debate is about trans people, isn't it? And whether trans people should have access to things of the opposite sex because they say they feel like the opposite sex. That's what the debate is.
And that is different than DSDs who have a variety of different sex issues. Yeah.
And then we can get into, with trans, there's all sorts of things people can get into. So is there a difference between people who medically transition and people who just declare an identity, people who socially transition? There's enough to already go at with the trans stuff that's not, where we have no answers at all. Like what does trans mean now? What does gender identity mean? What are we being asked to accept and to believe about people? Instead of arguing over rare medical conditions, they're the answers that we need to be looking for. But I suppose that's harder work, trying to get an answer to those things.
There's those. There was this media campaign. I'm sure it's going to come up again every Halloween. My culture is not your costume. My karyotype is not your costume. You guys should make some coffee mugs for that.
It's so. It's so. Do you know, the before this, one of the worst things for me was always, I'm in some Facebook groups with people with DSDs, and there are loads of trans activists in these groups, and they're bizarre medical complaints that they bring to us that we have to sit and It's just the trans women and their periods. I look at, when other women share examples on social media, and I just think, you've seen nothing. Join a DSD group, and you will see. Really? Yeah, that's where they really get into their mad ramblings about.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. That reminds me, I was speaking with Adam. He's a Twitter user. I had him on my channel, spoke about addiction, and he was speaking about how he'd do 12-step because he had some addiction issues. So he was doing 12-step, and that woke thing started coming in where it was a men's group, but now everybody has to start saying their pronouns and do land acknowledgments. And it seems like that's another vector of this weird kind of cultural madness. Like, it's impacting real groups. Like, we're here to talk about intersex conditions, and now we have to deal with all these mental health conditions.
Yeah.
Not even to disrespect or to argue whether or not you have that mental condition, that gender identity, but that is not what we are talking about. And you can't rope off you can't be exclusive anymore. You'll have LGBTI activists will join the group as well, and then they'll write these really passionate posts about how all children should be raised as babies because of your medical conditions. So, and the offensiveness of that, it's basically a group of women with medical, where everyone's happy to be a woman in the group, kind of, and then you get these people coming in going, well, because you're not really women, and oh, man.
And they think they're doing, they think, I don't know what they think. They obviously think they're being lovely. Yeah.